Charlie, thank you so much for coming down here this morning to the African American Civil War Museum to conduct this oral history interview for the Julian Bond Project. I really appreciate your time, and thank you for making that time for us this morning.
Happy to do it.
Okay. Why don't we start by having you tell us a little bit about your background, any influences you might have had growing up, and how that brought you into the Southern Freedom Movement.
Well, sure. I mean, there are several different strands with respect to that. I was born in Washington, D.C., and most of my family is still here in Washington, D.C. I spent probably my formative years in Springfield, Massachusetts, middle school years and high school years in Springfield, Massachusetts. My father was a Congregational, now United Church of Christ minister, and that takes care of the geography. But there are lots of other kinds of influences acting on me, some from the family. We grew up with stories of Mississippi, which is where my grandmother was from. And my grandmother was publicist for Mary Church Terrell, who had organized the colored women's clubs here in Washington, D.C. My grandmother had come to Washington, D.C. as a very young married woman at the beginning of the 20th century. So we had the stories, and her sister-in-law also, in particular, Hattie, who was obviously the sister of her husband, was really the one who told us the stories of slavery, of the farm, as she called it. I didn't realize until many years later that she was talking about Mississippi. It was just, I mean, she never really gave a geographic specificity. It's much later that I find out it's but the stories of slavery were stories that that's an important influence. And I come from a politically active family. My grandfather, whom I didn't know, who died young, but was active in the beginning days of the NAACP here in Washington, D.C. My father was active in civil rights. His brother, my uncle Jimmy, James Cobb, helped organize the National Alliance of Postal Workers, and he was a lawyer and became their lawyer.
What years were these?
These would have been in the 30s, maybe even the late 20s.
So we go back.
So there's all of that, and I come from a family that, almost without exception, me being the primary exception, completed higher education. My mother was the chair, eventually, of Romance languages at Howard University. My grandmother was a librarian at Moreland Spingarn at Howard University. My cousin, his father were lawyers and all of that. So there's that. And one of the things that meant in a politically engaged family is that there was material around to read. And we were expected to read it. So, I mean, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Daily Defender, the Washington Afro-American were delivered to our house. I mean, and we were made to read them. And we kept up with even not understanding a lot of that. We don't get television until the Montgomery bus boycott has erupted. I think that year was the first year we had a television in our house. But when we're watching the images of that boycott, these people, walking instead of taking the bus, and it's being explained to us what's going on, and it probably had a greater impact on us than, say, Little Rock, which involved people nearer to our own age, but we didn't see it. The main conversation I remember from the 50s was the 1954 Supreme Court decision. That was generating both excitement and concern and conversation. And so all of these are at play in shaping, and most notably, I suppose, the murder of Emmett Till. And if you've talked to SNCC people, you may have heard that we frequently refer to ourselves as the Emmett Till generation. But certainly, the impact of his murder, Emmett Till is killed when he's 14 years old, and I think I was 14 at the same time when Emmett, and a lot of us were on either side of 14, either 15 or 13, when Emmett Till is killed, and the way it reached us was not via television, but via Jet magazine, or The Jet as it was called back then, the double truck photograph of Emmett Till in this coffin literally stopped us, and we guys, because I remember these discussions taking place among guys, my friends, my male friends. I don't know to what extent it had that kind of impact among the women, although Joyce Ladner has said it did, and Dory, her sister. But that stopped us in our track. I can still remember standing on the street corners with all of us, 5 or 6 of us, looking at this picture and knowing somewhere in our guts, even if we didn't know what we were going to do, that it was going to end with our generation. That kind of, I suppose the story is well known. He's accused of whistling at this woman who's a clerk and wife of the owner of this grocery store, and ultimately kidnapped and really butchered and thrown into the Tallahatchie River. I mean, that probably, it wasn't a coherent political conversation. It was there's right and there's wrong, and we knew this was wrong, and had crossed some kind of line. I mean, we had all heard stories about Mississippi even before Emmett Till was, among adults, when you heard them talking, it was the worst place, not just on Earth, but in the universe for a black person. So, I mean, that was already in our heads, but this really, maybe because of the age, stopped us, and without question, in my mind, and probably of all the things that unfolded in the 50s, the Supreme Court decision, the Montgomery bus boycott, the Civil Rights Acts later on, Little Rock, of all the things that unfolded in the 50s, in other words, during our high school and middle school years, Emmett Till, his murder, probably had the biggest impact and is the biggest factor in the early shaping of our consciousness and awareness. I inched into activism gradually.
In high school?
Beginning in high school, because I was in high school when the sit-ins erupted in 1960 in Greensboro. And now we have one television. And we're still getting the newspapers, the Pittsburgh Courier, and not the Amsterdam News, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Washington Afro-American, and the Chicago Daily Defender, or the Chicago Defender. And those sit-ins, again, it's sort of like now in a more positive way, almost the same, similar kind of reaction to what we had towards Emmett Till. Now we're looking at people our own age, even if they were in college. But we're looking at members of our generation taking on defiantly racism and segregation. And they were college students for the most part. I would find out later that there were also protests initiated by high school students. But what was coming through to us in watching the sit-ins initially, certainly the Nashville student protests were well covered. the Atlanta student protests were welcome. Those are two I remember, and I vaguely remember I had this conversation with Chuck McDew because I seem to recall hearing something about Orangeburg protests, but they weren't as vivid in my mind as the Nashville protests and the Atlanta protests. So, and they were college students, and if you were black in the 12th grade, as I was, even considering college, the odds were overwhelming that you'd be going to an historically black college or university, HBCU. And with a handful of exceptions, Wilberforce, Central State, Lincoln, with a handful of exceptions, those schools were going to be in the South. And therefore, you were going to be confronted with precisely what you're seeing, these students in Nashville or Atlanta or wherever protesting. So the question that's coming through is, what are you going to do when you confront that? That's why I tell people that sit-ins were so important, because they shaped a certain kind of consciousness, and it helped shape a consciousness and the idea of political engagement that didn't exist before the sit-ins, because civil rights, when I was in the 12th grade, was something grown-ups did. You know, yeah, your parents may have signed you up to become a youth member of the NAACP or something like that. But civil rights struggle, Little Rock notwithstanding, was something that grown-ups did. And all decisions about what was going to be done in terms of civil rights was something that grown-ups made, not people your own age. And because of those sit-ins, my first political act of engagement, therefore, becomes picketing the Woolworths up north in support of what the Southern students were doing. And that's in 1960.
And when you say up north, where were you at this point?
Springfield,
In
Massachusetts.
Springfield. I understand you come to Howard in 1961.
61.
Why Howard and not another HBCU?
Well, it's a complicated. My landing at college is a little complicated, and it's a little unusual. I mean, I have family ties to Howard. You know, uncle, cousins who went to law school, or, you know, my mother and my father and my grandmother. You know.
So were you expected to be the next generation?
I was expected to go to college, and I was not enthusiastic about going to college in the first place, which is what I say, it makes me a little different in the sense, I was not, if you look at the SNCC people, and I think it's true for the core people too, a lot of the key people in core and SNCC were the first generation to get to college. In my case, I had family members that go all the way back to when Fisk University was Fisk Normal School. And every generation in my family, as far back, and once you get out of slavery, every generation in my family has sent its children to school. So in that sense, it was such an ordinary part of my family life that, you know, I didn't feel any special obligation to go to college. And I was reading things like Kerouac and the beatnik literature and poetry, and that seemed much more interesting than sitting in a classroom, which I had been doing for the previous 12 years, and I didn't have any clear fixed idea of what I wanted to be. It wasn't like I had always wanted to be a doctor since I was a kid, or I wanted to be a lawyer, or something concrete that might have been an incentive for college. I was pretty much ready to hit the road. It was my mother who talked me into going to college. And her argument, it wasn't an argument, was that if I went to college, I could become a part of the Peace Corps later on, which did interest me. And her position was that I should therefore give it a try, and I did. You know, I went to Howard in 61, that fall semester of 61. But I didn't have. It's funny, hadn't connected yet. Even though at one level I understood the people protesting, like Diane Nash or Julian Bond or Jim Bevel, or people I would come to know well later, even though they were my age, even though they were ahead of me in the education system, and I recognized there was something important in what they were doing. I hadn't connected my going to college with my taking a step into activism. It wasn't until I got to the Howard University campus that I found myself taking those steps that would lead me into one, protest activism in Maryland, in Virginia and Maryland, and ultimately into SNCC.
So what led you to join the Nonviolent Action Group at Howard? You did not.
I did not
Okay.
join the Nonviolent Action Group. What happened was, when I got to campus, the Howard Hilltop, the school newspaper, and remember, this is the fall of 1961. When I got to campus, the Howard Hilltop, the school newspaper, edited by Michael Thelwell, who was a key NAG activist, and had a front page story on the Howard students who had participated in the freedom rides that spring and summer. And I was sitting on the campus reading this. And I think they had a picture of Stokely on the cover, or somebody on the cover from Howard. So I'm reading this story about Howard University students participating in the, and as I'm reading it, someone gives me a leaflet saying there's going to be a protest in Maryland that weekend, and a bus would be leaving from in front of the library, Founders Library, to carry people who wanted to participate in that protest. And I think it was the combination of reading that story and thinking about it and being actually handed a leaflet that led me to a decision. I would take another step. I said, well, the way to learn more about this, and I'm still not thinking about engaging in protest, is to get on the bus and meet some of these people. And I do. I get on the bus that weekend. I meet some people, and we're talking. I mean, they really are explaining to me what this is all about, because I don't know anything. The bus goes to Baltimore, which again was a segregated city then, even though it's a northern city, Baltimore, Maryland. And I'm hanging out now with this group of Howard students. And while we're in the church, the person leading the orientation, Mitchell, Juanita Jackson Mitchell, big, prominent Baltimore family, both in terms of civil rights, in terms of money, and she wants to test some other places beside wherever they were planning to test in Baltimore. And the group I'm with decides to do that. And it's going to be in Annapolis. So I stick with this group. And I go to Annapolis with it. And so now I realize I'm now in a group that's planning to engage in some action and not no longer in a meeting in a church in Baltimore, something qualitatively different, even though they're planning action. So now I have to make a decision about what I'm going to. So I decide that I would, if they were going to picket, I could picket with them in front of wherever. And the place they chose was Antoinette's Pizza Shop, a place frequented by naval midshipmen. Except they decided, again, and I'm not in their discussions really, they decide instead of picketing, they would walk into the restaurant and sit down and order. And if they were refused service, refuse to leave. And I didn't realize this until they actually walked into the restaurant. And I walked in with them, and sure enough, they were asked to leave, and they refused to leave, and the police are called, and then when the police come, they not only refuse to leave, they go limp. A tactic I had never seen before, just make their bodies dead weight so they have to be dragged out. And I remember I recognized what they were doing right away and grabbed hold of the biggest person at the table and held on and dragged out. Now, and as a consequence, of course, now I'm landing in jail. And,
Is this your first time?
Yeah, this is all this same afternoon. It's one Saturday afternoon.
It sounds like a movie where it starts off at like 8:08 a.m.
Yeah.
And the whole movie is about one day.
Yeah, this is half a day.
Yeah.
And I wound up in Anne Arundel County Jail. Everybody there was much more a veteran activist than I was. For all and at least the ones I got to know later on were also upperclassmen. And I was a freshman at Howard University. I was 17 or 18 years old. And so that's when I begin to hear about the broader movement that's unfolding in the South. And I remember I hear about Robert Williams in Monroe, North Carolina. I hear about SNCC. I hear about Bob Moses in Southwest, in Macomb, Mississippi. This is all brand new information to me, and I'm asking about it. And I hear about Albany, Georgia. Bill Hanson was in jail with us, who was one of the few whites SNCC field secretaries, and he had just come back from Albany, Georgia. And I hear about the Freedom Rides, because a couple of people had been on the Freedom Ride. All of that in this time. It wasn't a lot of time in the jail. It was just 4 days, maybe 5 days max. But I'm getting this panoramic portrayal orally while in jail of this broader movement of which I knew nothing. And coming back from jail, I still never went to a NAG meeting. I was just a guy on campus, and I went and I joined protests several times after that without ever going to NAG. And I met NAG people, and it's funny, the first NAG people I met, setting aside Michael Thelwell for a while, it wasn't directly related to civil rights at all. I was going into the administration building to pay a bill. My parents had sent me a check to pay for something and wanted me to bring it to me. And when I walked to the universities, reached the university's administration building, two guys were sitting on the steps holding signs that said, "End ROTC." And I stopped and I asked them, "What's ROTC?" Because I didn't know what it was. We didn't have it Reserve Officers Training Corps, I think it stands for. We didn't have that where I went to school, but they had these signs saying, and it turns out these guys both were deeply involved with NAG and very much involved with SNCC. Were also a part of this ban the bomb movement. And very anti-war, and that was what they were doing, and they were talking to me about that, and within that context, they also began to talk to me about SNCC and NAG, and because I was telling them that I had participated in protests in Maryland, but I didn't know anything about this peace movement, ban the bomb movement, and they were talking to me about, we sustained a conversation for years after that. But all I did was, I mean, it was my freshman year, so I had to, orient myself to college.
You have a lot going on right now.
Yeah. And so I stayed, and I remember, since we're talking about Julian, I wrote Julian Bond a letter.
Okay.
I used to tease Julian because I never got it. But it's funny, what interested me was Monroe, North Carolina, and Robert Williams, because I wasn't sure about this nonviolence. But Robert Williams interested me in the sense that he had organized self-defense, and I wrote Julian a letter introducing myself as a Howard student and asking whether SNCC was doing anything there, and if they were, I would be interested in volunteering, some letter like that. And Julian doesn't remember getting it, and he probably doesn't. I don't even know if he got it, because it was, I knew his name had come up when I asked, well, how do you reach SNCC? And he was the communications director, and his name had come up in that kind of, so I just wrote something like Julian Bond, whatever the address was, Atlanta, Georgia. And I used to tease Julian for years after that. And you never answered my letter. When am I going to get an answer for my letter? And he would just laugh about it. And of course, by the time I became involved with SNCC, I understood why I never got an answer to that letter. But in any case, the demonstrations in Washington, Maryland, and Virginia weren't just SNCC demonstrations. They represented a kind of coordinating body. CORE was very prominent in that, the Civic Interest Group, Baltimore, NAG, and some other organizations. And because I had been involved in these sit-ins, CORE invited me to a workshop for student activists in Houston, Texas. And they gave me some money for a bus ticket, because they didn't fly you to these things in 1961. And I decided this would be an opportunity to see the whole South. And I had got this bus ticket, Washington, D.C., Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and so forth, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and on into Texas. I could see the whole South. And I had planned to get off the bus in Atlanta, Georgia, and physically introduce myself to SNCC. And the only name I knew of in SNCC was Julian's, but I knew that SNCC's headquarters were in Atlanta. However, the bus didn't get to Atlanta until midnight or something like that, so there was no prospect of getting off the bus and making my way. So I stayed on the bus, and the bus arrived in Mississippi in the morning. And I knew the students were sitting in Mississippi. And I called the NAACP, because they were in the phone book, and asked them how to get from the bus station to the headquarters of the students who were sitting, and they very kindly gave me directions from the bus station and that's the beginning of my real. Well, there's another story that's fairly involved about why it was I never made it to that workshop for student activists in Texas, some of which I tell in one of my books. Yeah.
So you just end up in Mississippi almost by chance?
By chance, really. I got off the bus and following the NAACPs, and I don't even know who it was at the NAACP that gave me the directions. I made my way to their headquarters on Lynch Street and walked into their headquarters and introduced myself. And the people who were there were Dory Ladner, Lawrence Guillot, Jesse Harris, and Colia Liddell. Those four people were there. And I explained, I'd been involved in the sit-in movement as a Howard University student, and I was now on the way to Texas for this workshop for people like me, students. And Guillot, who was a big guy, got up from his seat, and he kind of hovers over me with complete and total disdain. And at the same time, as I wrote about it somewhere, and I said at the same time he was both challenging and bullying. And people who know Lawrence Guillot know what I mean when I give that description of him. And he kind of stared at me and he said, you're going to Texas for a workshop on civil rights? What's the point of doing that when you're standing right here in Mississippi? Which is a brand new idea to me. And then Jesse Harris, who was one of the student leaders, not a student, Jesse was out of school by then, I think, out of high school, I mean. Jesse chimed in. He said something like, yeah, man, you're in the war zone here. And we had this conversation. I mean, and I decided to just stay overnight and learn some more about these people. And see, because Emmett Till's murder had completely defined my thinking about Mississippi, the idea that students were protesting in Mississippi was a radical new idea for me. I felt it was one thing for me to be sitting in Maryland, but something qualitatively different for students in Mississippi, this place where Emmett Till was killed, to be protesting. So I wanted to know more. Maybe it was my early reporter's instinct, perhaps. But I wanted to know more about them. So I decided to stay overnight because they had a Freedom House that you could stay in. That was another kind of headquarters, more for eating and for sleeping.
What town are you in?
Jackson, Mississippi. And I did. And Guillot, SNCC was just beginning its Delta project. Sam Block had already gone over to the Delta, gone over to Greenwood from Cleveland, Mississippi, where he was from. And LaVon Brown, who was from Macomb, Mississippi, where Bob had begun working in Mississippi, had also gone up into Greenwood to begin this project around voter registration. This project was being encouraged by AMZ Moore, the NAACP president from Cleveland and also vice president of the NAACP. But I stayed another day, and while I was there, the phone rang, and it was Sam saying this mob was breaking down the doors of their headquarters and that they had called the FBI, and the FBI said if anything happens, they couldn't do anything, but if anything happens, to call them back. And then the phone went dead. Well, my attitude now was, this is how you slowly get involved with the movement. Well, I had just been talking to Gian, so I didn't feel I could get on a bus and go to Texas without knowing what had happened to Gian, right? That's the way I think, anyway. And Bob was going up to begin a project in Sunflower County, bringing 2 students, Landy McNair and Charles McLaurin. So I decided to go up with them. One, to find out, I had made 2 decisions. One, to go up with them to find out, well, what had happened to these guys. And as it turned out, they had jumped out of a window and scurried across some roofs and slid down a television antenna and kind of disappeared into the black community, which was, you know. And anyway, they had gotten away. And the other decision I made was to join Landy and McLaurin in Sunflower County, because I said to myself, well, it's summertime. I don't have to be in school. This is in July of '62, I guess it was. So I don't have to be in school until the fall, September, and I don't have to be at this workshop for activists in Texas. I felt no guilt about using Corps' money to do something different, something Dave Dennis teases me about, of Corps. But so I essentially wind up going up into the Delta and landing in Sunflower County, Louisville, with McLaurin and Levant and me as the third driver. We got there that same night. We drove up, but the town had a curfew for black people. So Bob, who was driving, felt it was not worth either the risk to ourselves or the risk to anybody who might greet us to attempt to stay be out on the road or street in violation of the curfew. So we went on to Cleveland, Mississippi, which is only a few miles away, to Amzie Moore's home, and then Amzie brought us back to Louisville the following day. The Delta, cotton country of Mississippi, was 2/3 black, and only a fraction of that population was registered to vote, or at least in part because they considered it too dangerous. In a deeper sense, what we were doing was organizing communities to take control of their lives. And that involved much more than working with people on things like the literacy test of the voter registration form, or talking to people about the importance of the vote. Everybody really understood how important it was to vote. The question was, but you were up against this paralyzing fear. You could lose your job or your life, your house, lots of things. And people, if you're going to ask people to do that, you have to figure out how to build a relationship with people that enables them to trust you. Because, I mean, anybody can come in there and say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And when the going gets tough, they're nowhere to be seen. You have to overcome that fundamental suspicion. And people in the Delta are like rural people everywhere. While they may not have a great deal of reading, writing literacy, have excellent people literacy. And they know when you're giving them a bunch of BS. And they are very slow to respond to you. Older people. Kids, there's a whole other story about younger people. But if you're talking about adults old enough to register to vote, they're going to be slow and cautious. And you have to figure out how to. So a lot of the work was talking to people inside the black community. And there were lots of ways to do that. There's a real, I mean, here I am, a guy from D.C. and Massachusetts, so they are naturally curious. I mean, do you know the president? You're from Washington, D.C. I mean, these are questions that came up. What's it like up north? You know, because we're not in some southern city. Ruleville had 1,100 people, this little town in Sunflower County. So there are questions that revolve around curiosity. And then, you know, and there's a wide range of those questions that also include, how'd you get here? And then you're asking them, why won't you think about registering? Boy, son, that's white folks' business. I don't know how many times I heard something like that from people. And it takes a while to get even. What you do find is that in all these communities, and I suspect it may be applicable today, even in urban areas where black people are mostly concentrated now, there are inside these communities kind of natural leaders. And you can make your way to them, or people steer you to them. And so a lot of that is getting them to legitimize you being there in their communities. And it's important to make clear, if you're organizing, that you're not there to take over their communities. You're not there to tell them what to do. You're not there to tell them what's right and what's wrong, or what's correct and what's incorrect. To these leaders, you know, when Amzie Moore brought us to Ruleville, McLaurin, Landy, and myself, he took us, it was a Sunday, and he took us to the Mount Galilee Missionary Baptist Church and stood us up and told the congregation that he had brought some freedom riders, which gave us a kind of credibility, partly because Amzie was so highly respected, and partly because everybody knew the freedom riders. You know, people more often than not called us freedom riders or nonviolent than they called us SNCC. SNCC really didn't much exist in people's consciousness, but the freedom rides, that did. And the nonviolence, I think that's because of King, did. And then Andy hands us over to this 76-year-old man and his wife, where we stay with. But here's a man, as it turned out, he couldn't even read or write, but he was highly respected, a man of great probity, and had registered to vote in the early 1950s when the Regional Council of Negro Leadership existed and was encouraging voter registration as part of the post-World War II thrust. Because there were a handful of black people in Sunflower County that had registered to vote. So, and I tell his story in my gun book. He, you know, took us in, and again, just the simple fact that he took us in gave us legitimacy in the community and enabled the organizing. It didn't mean that people were going to just go down and try and register to vote because we were staying with Mr. Joe, as we called him. But our presence had a kind of legitimacy than it would not have had if we were staying in some other town and then periodically coming into Ruleville to try and get people to register to vote. Well, it took us, given the times, not that long time. It took us about a month or so to get the first group. The second group, actually, McLaurin brought down 3 people, but the first significant group, 18 people, to try and register to vote in Sunflower County. Mrs. Hamer was among them, and we had rented a bus that was used, old school bus really, that was used to carry day workers to the cotton fields, to bring people to the county courthouse at Indianola, which is 20 some odd miles away. I think it's 26 miles away from Louisville, and also the birthplace of the White Citizens Council. After a mass meeting the night before and all that, these 18 people had agreed to go the next day. And we got on the bus with them and drove on down to Indianola, to the courthouse. And Mrs. Hamer was the first person. And the thing about it is that everybody was scared. And this is when Mrs. Hamer first comes to our attention, because on the way down she's singing all these church songs. And what she's doing is just reinforcing the people and trying to ease their fear. And you know, black people in the South especially, you know, fled into the arms of Christianity for succor and salvation. And it's a way to, this is the story of the spirituals of the 19th century and the 18th century. I mean, this is all, that's what Mrs. Hamer was doing. You could see that. And it taught me anyway, that it's really important to have some people like Mrs. Hamer can do what you cannot do. There's nothing I could offer the people. I couldn't offer them protection. I couldn't even offer them attention by anybody of importance. Mrs. Hamer, as Bob says, Mississippi to the bone, could do that. So we get there. Mrs. Hamer's the first person to go into the courthouse to try and register to vote. And very quickly, the courthouse, the circuit clerk's office where you had to go to register, it's shut down, it's closed. By this time, whites have started to gather in front of the court. The group from Louisville is now on the steps, on the portico of the courthouse, and then they're surrounded by these white people, both coming from outside the courthouse and inside the courthouse, and they've got these pistols, and they're muttering, and they're using all these awful names. You don't know what is going to happen, but people got back on the bus. And this took a long time because we're getting almost to the end of the day. And we get back on the bus, and then some officer from the sheriff's office arrests the bus driver, says he's driving a bus of the wrong color because it's a school bus. And the poor guy, and all he was trying to do was make a few bucks. You know, I don't think he went down there to register to vote. And he's arrested. And now what to do? Now everybody really is visibly scared. And Mrs. Hamer starts to sing again. And this time she's singing like movement songs. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Oh, freedom, stuff like that. And again, through the sheer power and intensity of her voice, she's able to shore up the people on the bus. Because again, we've got nothing, us sick people. We've got absolutely nothing to offer people. Not protection, not attention, nothing to offer people. So, and what happens is they form a little committee, as I remember, to go, because the bus driver is still sitting in the police car in front of the courthouse, and they form a little group to go ask the policeman what it will take to get this guy unarrested, or you know, and what it would take, you know, to enable him to drive the bus back to Louisville, because people don't have any way to get home. And he says, well, there's a fine. And how much? I think the fine was $100. And people go back, oh, well, there isn't $100. All the money on that bus didn't equal $100. It was, you know, We're talking 1962, rural Mississippi. That's a significant amount of money. So they do take up a collection. I think you could check with Dory or somebody because she was there. It was $46, I think, was the amount that was collected, including the amount of money the SNCC people were able to put into the pot. And they go back, this group, to the policeman and say, look, we have $46, and I mean, that's all we can pay, and if it's not enough, you might as well just arrest us all. Which, if you think about it, that's an amazing thing to take place on a Mississippi road as dusk is coming in and you're a target because you attempted to exercise some civil right that's been denied you for 75 years or 100 years. It was an enormously courageous thing to do. And the policeman took the $46 and let the bus driver go. Now, I really don't know. I tell people all the time that this $46 ever made it into the coffers of the Sunflower County government. But
Probably not.
But he was able to drive everybody back, to Ruleville. And of course, following this, there's a lot of reprisal. And the story of Mrs. Hamer is pretty well known. Getting kicked off the plantation. Other people, there was one guy whose son eventually becomes involved with the movement, Lafayette Cerny, had a dry cleaning, I think, or a laundry. And they shut him down for inappropriate license. And a beautician, I think, was, it's a town, and there were a few little small businesses, black-owned businesses, because it's a segregated town, and you have to have, even in these little segregated towns, some basic services, like a barbershop, a beautician, things like that. And then there was a shooting, and I write about it a lot in the gun book. Again, the Sison family was an important supporter of the movement, and they lived just down the street from the road, because no road in the black community was paved. From the McDonald's where we were staying, and the night riders came through and they shot up our house and the Sison house. And they wounded two girls, one of whom was the Sison's granddaughters, who were just stopping in to say hello before returning to college where they were enrolled. I think it was all Alcorn. And severely wounding one. And I wasn't in the McDonald's house, but in this little town in the still of a Mississippi night, I mean, you can hear the shots and you can know where they came from. And I went racing back across town because I could see the shots had come from what was called the sanctified quarters, which is one of two black quarters in the town for blacks. And I was told the girls had been taken to the hospital, the county hospital, and I went there and began asking questions. And the mayor ordered me arrested and he, for interfering with their investigation by asking a lot of silly questions, he said. And he hands me over, interestingly enough, to the town constable, who's the brother of the man who killed Emmett Till. Because the Milams had moved from Greenwood, from Tallahatchie County, where they were when Emmett Till was killed, to Ruleville after the trial, and had set up shop in Ruleville. And the brother, who may or may not have been involved in the killing of Till, was the constable of Ruleville, and they handed me over to him, who sits me next to this big old dog. It's all about intimidation. I mean, that's all it is about. And there I am, thrown into this jail, and it is scary because if you've ever seen these little jails in Mississippi towns, the cells open right out onto the street. So anybody can stick a pistol in there and shoot you or do anything you want. Or you can talk to people from your cell because they're standing outside the cell. So, and I spent the night there before I'm released, because it was all about just trying to, do whatever they can to intimidate. And I sort of knew that, or I had to believe that. Anyway, they weren't going to snatch me. You never can tell. And as I wrote, they had confiscated Mr. Joe's rifle as a result of my arrest. And the mayor was arguing, it was all a plot by Charlie Cobb, Bob Moses, Charles McLaurin, and Lenny McNair to generate false publicity for their disruptive activities. And there was a little piece in the local paper quoting the mayor. And they had confiscated Mr. Joe's shotgun, little .22 shotgun. And he was now worried about, because Mr. Joe was poor. He was old, 76. And he had 3 young guys staying in his house with his wife, eating their food. And he put food on the table by going out and hunting, shooting something, a squirrel, something like that, a rabbit, and keeping the varmints out of his garden with his gun. And without the gun, it was a serious proposition. And I've told the gun control people this story all the time. I said, but you have a right to your gun. And he wanted to know if we were certain about that. And we had a book, history book, that had the U.S. Constitution in it. And I went and got it, turned to the Constitution and the Second Amendment, and read the Second Amendment out loud. And McLaurin said, "You see, Mr. Joe, that's where it says so, right in the United States Constitution." And Mr. Joe told me to fold over the page I had been reading to him from, and then he took the book from me. And I forgot about it, really. Then a little while later, Mr. Joe is not around. We asked his wife, Rebecca, "Where's Mr. Joe?" And she says, "Well, he went to get his gun. You all said it was all right." And now we're getting nervous because, the last thing, there's enough weight that we're carrying in terms of economic reprisals. These 2 girls have been killed. The last thing we need to have happen is for Mr. Joe to get hurt or killed doing something he thought we had assured him was all right for him to do. I didn't want to have to explain that to Rebecca McDonald. And we're about to go down there after him when he pulled up. He had an old, really raggedy truck. It was loud and raggedy, recognizable. And he pulled up in his truck, and of course we asked what had happened. He said, "Well, I went to get my gun." And we said, "Well, did you get it?" He said, "Yeah. The mayor said," he explained, "the mayor said I didn't have a right to this gun, but I had your book." And I opened it up to the book page you had read to me and told the mayor, "This book says I do." And the mayor gave me my gun back. And I remember him, I still fix my, he's stepping out of the truck and he's holding his .22 shotgun over his head with this big smile on his face, and goes in the house. And the thing is, Mr. Joe couldn't read or write. If the mayor had asked him to read the passage, he couldn't have done it. But he just took our word for it. And that's what the organizing is. You organize people not so much to risk their lives, but to assert themselves in new ways, in ways they hadn't thought about. McLaurin told me at one point, he said, "Mr. Joe never challenged a white man about anything in all of his 76 years." But because we said it was all right, he was prepared to challenge this white man. And that's what you're doing as an organizer. You know, and it's slow work. It's not dramatic. It's not like a massive protest march. It's not covered by the press. It's literally putting one foot in front of the other and stepping forward, talking to somebody. Of course, the town in the black community just completely shut down to the idea of voter registration after those two girls were shot, and it took a long time to rebuild faith that voter registration was something to try again. It wasn't that they doubted the value, but they're constantly weighing risk versus gain, you know, and it's very slow, and that's what the organizing was it's the same story in all these little towns, in all these counties, right across the Black Belt, whether it's Southwest Georgia, Central Alabama, the Arkansas Delta, Mississippi Delta. It's the same story. North Louisiana, it's that story. The violence varies, you know, but that's the story. Firstly, it wasn't a decision made by all of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and I'll explain that a little later. And it all relates to, in many ways, to what we consider the betrayal in Atlantic City. Rather naively, a number of us, probably in SNCC, rather naively, thought once we demonstrated the facts on the ground, or the facts of the situation in Mississippi, you know, recognizing the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party had to happen, and as I say, it's probably a naive viewpoint, but I think a number of people thought that. Not everybody, and therefore, coming out of Atlantic City, there was this very strong feelings of bitterness and betrayal on the part of our liberal so-called friends, because the people who stabbed the MFDP in the back were, one, the black establishment, two, the labor establishment, three, the Liberal Democratic Party establishment. Those were the people stabbing the MFDP, the people who had expressed support initially for this challenge. And what we learned from that is that you may be right, but most people will only go so far with you. Then there's always a reason they can't go all the way with you, which is what we experienced in Atlantic City. So this triggered what I like to call the where do we go from here discussions within the context of our feelings of bitterness and betrayal. Now, SNCC was not of a single mind about this. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which had been organized in Mississippi by SNCC and CORE field secretaries, decided to go with Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey, notwithstanding what happened in Atlantic City. It wasn't a decision many in SNCC agreed with, but as Guyot pointed out, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is the Mississippians' party. And it's their party to decide what they want to do with it. And you can't, as an organizer, be encouraging people to find their voice, to make decisions about the factors in their lives that they think of as important, and then turn around and say, well, I don't agree with what you are saying, so I'm not going to work with you. You're on your own. You can't, I suppose you can do that. It's been done many times in human history. But Guyot was right. The MFDP was the Mississippians' party. there was another idea, again, that gained strength in the aftermath of the 19th, the idea of an independent black political party. Stokely was very much interested in that, and that's why he didn't fight the MFDP or Giat around on this idea. He went to Alabama, and ultimately we would get the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, or the first Black Panther Party. So that's one. And then there were events that we didn't have any control over at all that also encouraged us to experiment with electoral politics. Georgia is a primary example of that, where the state, under court order, redistricts and creates 13 new legislative districts that are predominantly black, which means that a black person will occupy the seat representing those districts. This is something new in some ways. And certainly in Ivanhoe Donaldson's thinking, and Ivanhoe was the real primary force for the Julian Bond campaign. And Ivanhoe, probably more than many of us, was interested in electoral politics, as his later life shows. Persuaded Julian to run.
How did he persuade him?
I wasn't present.
Okay.
I don't know. I know Ivanhoe well enough to have a sense that, you know, how Ivanhoe would have pressed Julian. You know, Julian, you've got to do this. You have the prestige. You know, you're a part of SNCC, and if we organize, we can win it. You know, I never pressed Julian on the question of exactly how enthusiastic he was about gaining electoral office at that point. He later did make a career, but in his...
He had never talked to you about this, or anyone? Did he ever express any interest in running for office?
No. Julian was a poet, and actually Julian's ambition as a very young man was to be a stand-up comedian. Well, I never talked to Julian about his political ambitions in those days. As far as I could see, Ivanhoe had as much to do with that as any thoughts that Julian... I mean, I can imagine Ivanhoe, you know, pressing Julian, man, you gotta, you know, you can win, you know, you're known, your family is known. All of the arguments that Ivanhoe would make. He made the same kind of arguments with me, because I wasn't that interested in electoral politics either. And we were at a SNCC staff meeting, I think, in Holly Springs, Mississippi. So it might have been a Mississippi staff meeting somewhere. And Ivanhoe told me, he said, well, we need to run Julian for one of these, you know, something like that. And you need to come on over to Atlanta and help me put this together. I mean, we had that conversation in Holly Springs, Mississippi. And I assume we had a similar conversation with Judy Richardson, who I don't remember whether Judy was in Atlanta then and came there from somewhere else, or came there from somewhere else. But Ivanhoe was really the driver of that Bond campaign in '65, and I was intellectually interested in Atlanta's a city, and everything I had done in the South had been in the rural South, and it even then it was clear to me if we figured out how to organize effectively in the cities, and that had all kinds of implications for places like Chicago and New York, Los Angeles, and these big urban areas where now blacks by the middle 1960s were in the final stages of their last migration. the one from the south to the north, the one that had begun in whenever World War One. This was the '60s, and you could see it in Mississippi. Because by 1965, the Mississippi I was looking at in the rural Delta was noticeably different than the one I had come to just 3 years earlier. Mechanization was clearly underway, and I don't know whether Frank talked to you about organizing the Mississippi Freedom Labor Union, and what well, because Frank had a big hand in and one of the weaknesses of trying to organize labor unions on cotton plantations is human labor is simply not needed. They had perfected, the mechanization, everything from irrigation to cotton picking, had pretty much been perfected by the mid-1960s. And that's an important piece of this last migration to the north. So part of my thinking for the Bond campaign, in Atlanta, we may learn something about urban organizing because Atlanta is clearly a city. And that really tilted the balance, swinging me to be willing to work with Ivanhoe on the campaign despite my substantial disinterest, which may just be suspicion of electoral politics. And that's what we did. We pretty much worked in Atlanta the way we worked in the rural South. It's knocking on doors. Do you know Julian Bond is running? We had leaflets. I think once or twice, Ivanhoe, I pretended to be Julian.
Did you find much of a what kind of reception was
it? Was
you
a
getting?
good reception. It was a good. I mean, in some respects, it was easier. One, we weren't up against the kind of violence we were up against in Mississippi or Alabama, and I think there was, because this was the first time this has happened, a level of excitement, that really doesn't exist now. I'm talking to some of the young people today who are working on the midterm elections, because one of the big questions I have for some parts, in Florida, for instance, where I live, is why the turnout was so low. And so
how was turnout for Julian's election? I mean, do you remember?
I don't remember, but I think it was pretty good. I don't remember, though. It was pretty good, especially considering we didn't have the transportation machinery to get people. We really were dependent on people.
So this was
going
shoe leather,
yeah, well,
door to door,
yeah,
knocking.
yeah.
Any trouble finding volunteers or
No.
lining people up to help?
No, and it probably helped that it was Julian.
Why so?
It was a name that is known. I mean, and his father is known, and his mother is known. I mean, these things help, I think, in political races. Ask the Kennedys.
Was he? Do you think he was a natural politician?
Yeah, well, he's naturally congenial, and he's easy with people. Yeah, so that's a natural thing. For instance, if you want to compare it to somebody today, Hillary Clinton is not. Yeah, he's easy and comfortable. He's not going to complain about being with poor people in their homes or drinking coffee with them. I mean, he's easy with people.
And that
counts for a lot. And he wasn't coming from in a weird way. I think this has to do with his association with SNCC. He really wasn't seen as coming from the black bourgeois establishment. his dad notwithstanding, his mom notwithstanding.
What was the reaction of the local black establishment to Julian running? I mean,
I think we'll tolerate it, kind of cool. I mean, they're not going to fight the Bond family.
was there any
Yes,
expectation that he would win?
I don't know. I always did. I always
You thought he was gonna
I
win.
thought he was going to win. But I thought the knocking on doors and face to face with ordinary people trumped, establishment credentials. I think the establishment was surprised that he won. It's interesting. This always happens. That's the way the establishment was very surprised when Marion won here the first time in D.C. He was not expected to win for the same reason, and he won for the same reason.
So after Julian wins, and the SNCC publishes the Vietnam War. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I should also say there was opposition in SNCC to us doing this.
Let's hear more about
Because that's selling out to the Democratic Party. It's becoming a part of the establishment. SNCC is not supposed to do that. I mean, there was, I can remember going in the office a couple of times at least, maybe more than that, and I had on a jacket and a tie.
And this wasn't going over well.
Yeah, no, it didn't go over well at all because I was going somewhere on behalf of Julian to do something, and I explained to people, look, the whole idea is to win here, and I wore a jacket and a tie on a couple of occasions in Atlantic City too, but it fueled a certain. I mean, again, this is part of the overflow of what happened in Atlantic City, and now here's Charlie and Ivanhoe in their coats and ties at least occasionally, and it is just.
This is a remarkable transition for you. You go from wandering on a bus to being in the middle of a historic state legislative campaign.
Yeah.
Did you ever stop for a moment and ask yourself, how did I end up here?
Not really. I mean, 'cause in my head it's clear. I mean, the progression.
Yeah.
In my head, and I don't worry about it too much. It's the way life turned out, given the first step, the second step, the third step, and the fourth. Some of it's personal. I mean, I really got involved with the Julian Bond campaign in the final analysis because Ivanhoe asked me to do it, and we had been working in Mississippi together for all that time. And who knows, if somebody else had asked me, I might not have done it. That's the way it.
So after Julian wins, obviously there's the controversy over his seating.
Yes.
Can you tell us anything about how that all went down?
Well, by now the Vietnam War is heating up, and Julian really didn't have a hand in it, but we being a whole group of Sammy Young had been murdered in Tuskegee, Alabama, for trying to use the white bathroom at a gas station, and the Freedom School students in Macomb, Mississippi, in their newsletter had also raised the question of Vietnam. Why should we go, or why should our fathers go to Vietnam and we don't have freedom here? Something like that. I think their statement is available somewhere. So there's this, and then the third factor, of course, is that we were draft age. And some of us, and there were attempts to I think I received a draft letter I can't remember whether it was before the Julian Bond campaign or after the Julian Bond, but I was drafted somewhere in here and told to report for duty, and anyway, I didn't get, they decided they didn't want me. But, so there's that going on, and we really decided SNCC, and it might have been a decision of SNCC's executive committee. I don't remember. The SNCC should issue a public and formal statement on the war, and I'm pretty sure it's Sammy Young's murder that triggered that decision. And we wrote it, and the powers that be in the Georgia State legislature were outraged and refused to seat Julian because he was one still. No, he had stepped down as SNCC communications director by then, but refused to disavow the statement. And they refused to allow him to be seated. That was the nub of the issue, and so we had to run another election, and he won again. Probably got more votes. I never looked up the numbers. Now that I'm talking to you, I'm wondering whether the numbers were larger or smaller the second time around, because there was a lot of outrage in the black community in Atlanta. Whatever they may have thought about Julian or whatnot, they were outraged that the white people were doing this to a young black guy who had been out there fighting for civil rights. There was that kind of outrage in the black community in Atlanta.
What do you think was a bigger motivation for the legislative establishment? I mean, Sloppy Floyd, was it race, or was it Vietnam, or was it a combination of all this?
It almost certainly was a combination. Yeah. It was easier to do because of race, but I don't think it was solely because of race. We know this from just watching the McCarthy era in this country. But I don't know. Ultimately, I mean, we see something like this today with the Trump and his people. We see something like this today. This kind of mean-spirited stupidity. You know, it makes no sense when you give it any kind of rational thought. I mean, if Julian had declared himself a communist, a communist with the support of communist China, they still would have had to see him in the final analysis. But this kind of stupid hysteria, and they weren't used to people speaking out against the wars that our boys were fighting for America.
How did the decision come together to challenge this in court?
I don't know. I wasn't involved with that. I was not involved with that.
Okay. Is there anything else about that race that's helpful for us to know?
Not really. I mean, I think it's important to stress that the work in that race has extreme relevance today, insofar as the young people who form the movement for Black Lives, etc., are thinking about organizing. And it's very clearly, if I look at my first interactions in any serious way with them, which would be around 2015 to now, there's been a sort of growing appreciation for the necessity of organizing as distinct from protesting, which is not to disparage protests, which is always necessary. But there's growing interest in organizing and the how-tos of organizing, and they're beginning to think that there are some useful things from the 60s that they can draw on for what, as in my own company, I tell them I think they have a harder mission today. I mean, I can tell them anything they want to know about organizing in Sunflower County or Tallahatchie County. But if you ask me about the west side of Chicago or south central Los Angeles, I don't know how helpful I will be when you drill down to specifics. But I think insofar as learning how to talk to people, which is what we had to do up in the Delta or in central Alabama, I think that idea is still relevant. Encouraging people to build structures that they control and that can assert their needs, such as the MFDP or the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, is still relevant for today. So, and the Bond campaign, insofar as electoral politics is concerned, is still valuable. And it's interesting. I had a conversation with one of Stacey Abrams' people who made that point that you know, this early work from 50 years ago is relevant to what they're trying to do now. It's not an exact fit. It can't be in the year 2019. So I still think there are important lessons in the Bond campaigns in terms of what it accomplished, how it shaped Julian.
How did it shape him?
Well, it plugged him in. He never left politics after that. You know, it's in a lot of ways, it's I think it I don't know for sure what course he was on, but it kind of reversed that course he seemed to be on in the middle.
From professor to politician.
Yeah, or poet to politician, perhaps, or comedian. Yeah, I would be clearly, because he does go on to serve a considerable amount of time in the legislature, and was ambitious enough to run for the Congress, although he lost, ironically, to John Lewis. I mean, he was on a political course, and I don't think I would have imagined, for lots of reasons, in 1965, Julian heading the NAACP.
And why do you say that?
Well, part of it is just because our view of the NAACP and what it was under Roy Wilkins and Gloucester Current and that whole crowd who hated us seemed so entrenched.
They hated you, why?
Huh?
They hated you, why?
They felt we were traversing their territory. They felt that we were costing them money because we were constantly getting arrested. They felt we were taking attention from the more important work that they were doing. And then I think Roy Wilkins just didn't like us for whatever reasons. I tried to pull that out of Roger Wilkins once many years ago. I don't know. I never understood Roy Wilkins. I never understood him or the director of branches at the time, Gloucester Current. But there was, if you read Jim Foreman's Making of Black Revolutionaries, there is somewhere in there's a memo that records a meeting that took place immediately after the MFDP challenge in Atlantic City. It's a meeting with Roy Wilkins. It was put together by the National Council of Churches. Roy Wilkins, Gloucester Current. I think Cortland was there. The SNCC people were there, and some other people. And the agenda was how to lessen SNCC's influence in Mississippi. That's what the meeting was about. And what comes through when you hear the NAACP, I mean, they just, they don't like SNCC, and they don't like, as Gloucester Current termed them, they don't like us involving the underbrush. And there needs to be a top level decision making, not this decision making by the underbrush is what Current called them. So there's this, I don't know, the national headquarters are so radically different from their local branches. It's some of it I understood. Ruby Hurley, who was the Southern director, felt that SNCC, and to a lesser extent CORE, were pulling people who really should be a part of NAACP youth branches. But So it would have been hard for me in 1965 to imagine Julian leading the NAACP, let alone Derek Johnson, who was president of the NAACP now and who was deeply influenced by SNCC and Hollis Watkins in particular.
Yes.
And I think Julian's instincts weren't to seek political office. And I never felt until he got into the campaigning that's really what he wanted. Well, I think there's more than one strand to follow if we're going to look at Julian's legacy. One is a lot of the information that reached the public in the 1960s and is used by scholars now has to do with how Julian organized the communications department of SNCC and how he, with words and photographs, helped define a particular era in organization, SNCC. It shows, in particular, that a national, if you're talking about social activism, that a national headquarters doesn't have to be disconnected from its grassroots work and field work. That's part of Julian, from the time throughout his life, Julian put the conversation about race front and center and made it impossible to ignore. And this is valuable because not everybody can do that. And no matter what whether you're talking about Julian Bond, the state legislator, Julian Bond, the SNCC communications director, Julian Bond, the leader of the NAACP, Julian Bond as co-founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center, or Julian Bond, the college professor. I mean, when you think about it, that's an enormous contribution for one person. It's not that the movement revolved around Julian, but this is one person who managed to use his life in such a way that crucial issues of both race and class, I would argue, could not be ignored. It's the great legacy because it's a legacy that other people can pick up on and figure out how to do something similar, how to use their lives in a similar way. That's what I think. I don't think of Julian in terms of monuments and all of that, or even great written works. Julian wrote surprisingly little for someone like him. He wrote. There are two people who wrote surprisingly little to me. One is Julian, and the other is Ella Baker, which is, in a sense, is unfortunate. But I don't think it detracts from his legacy because what we get from Julian, the written word is not necessary. It'd be nice, but it's not no more than what we get and still use from Miss Baker. The written word.
I've heard some people describe Julian Bond as one of the first crossover figures into white audiences, that he could speak to white audiences about the topics you've suggested, but leave them not as uncomfortable if, let's say, somebody else had done the same thing. Is that something you would agree with?
I think I would agree with that. I don't know whether he's the first or I don't know,
Among the first.
but he certainly can do that. I've seen him do that.
Mhm.
You know, but I certainly would agree with